Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information provided in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Divorce laws and their applications vary significantly by state jurisdiction and individual circumstances. This content focuses on historical trends and demographic studies within the United States. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal and financial professionals regarding their specific situation before making any life-altering decisions. For every 10 men watching this right now, statistically, 4 or 5 of you will navigate the complex, often grueling machinery of the United States family court system at some point in your life. But here is the statistic that should keep you awake at night. According to longitudinal demographic studies, women initiate nearly 70% of divorces in the United States, and that number surges to approximately 90% when the couple is college educated. We are currently witnessing a seismic shift in the American domestic landscape, a phenomenon researchers call the silver tsunami, where divorce rates for men over the age of 50 have doubled since the 1990s. While younger generations are marrying later or not at all, the men who built their lives in the traditional model are finding themselves in a demographic crosshair that many never saw coming. This is not just about the end of a contract. It is about a statistical reality that often results in a massive redistribution of assets, a total recalibration of social circles, and a documented decline in long-term health outcomes for men. The loop we are opening today is simple but haunting. Why are the most established men in America the ones most at risk for a total lifestyle collapse? And what does the data actually say about who survives the transition with their wealth and mental health intact? This deep dive masterclass is designed to solve the problem of informational asymmetry. For too long, the conversation around divorce has been driven by emotion or anecdotal evidence. Today, we are stripping that away to look at the cold, hard demographic data. This solves the problem of the unknown. By the end of this 10-part series, you will understand the historical trends that led to the current legal environment, the potential outcomes of asset division based on equitable distribution versus community property states, and the case studies of men who successfully navigated the demographic marriage squeeze. We are going to look at why certain income brackets are more insulated from divorce than others, and how the education gap has become the single greatest predictor of marital stability in the 21st century. This is your roadmap through the data-driven reality of the American divorce industrial complex. To understand where a man stands today, we must first look at the historical pivot point of 1969. Before this year, the United States largely operated under a fault-based system. To obtain a divorce, a spouse had to prove fault, such as adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. This created a demographic barrier that kept divorce rates relatively low and stable. However, with the passage of the Family Law Act in California, signed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan, the no-fault divorce revolution began. Within a decade, this spread across the country, fundamentally changing the demographic trajectory for American men. Data from the National Center for Health Statistics shows an immediate and sharp incline in divorce filings following these legislative changes. This transition moved divorce from a legal battle over wrongdoing to a mathematical exercise in asset division and custodial scheduling. For men, this meant that the traditional protections of providing and protecting no longer served as a legal shield against the dissolution of the family unit. When we look at modern demographic studies, specifically those from the Pew Research Center and the U.S. Census Bureau, we see a startling divergence in how divorce affects men based on their socioeconomic status. This is often referred to by sociologists as the marriage gap. Men with a 4-year college degree are significantly more likely to remain married than those with a high school diploma or less. The data suggests that for college-educated men, the divorce rate has actually been declining since the 1980s. However, for men in the lower and middle income brackets, the rate remains high or is increasing. This creates a dual reality for American men. On one hand, you have high-earning, highly educated men who are staying married longer, but when they do divorce, the financial stakes are exponentially higher due to accumulated assets and professional licensing. On the other hand, you have men in trade or service sectors who face frequent marital transitions, often leading to a cycle of what researchers call multi-partner fertility, which complicates their financial and legal standing across decades. Let us look at a specific case study involving the silver tsunami, or gray divorce. Consider a hypothetical but data representative man named Robert, aged 58. Robert has been married for 30 years, has 2 adult children, and is looking toward retirement. In the 1970s, Robert's demographic was the least likely to divorce. Today, however, Robert is part of the fastest-growing group of divorcees. Data from the American Community Survey indicates that for every 1,000 married persons aged 50 and older, 10 divorced in 2024, a rate that has doubled since 1990. For men like Robert, the demographic data shows a specific wealth shock. Unlike a 30-year-old who has decades to rebuild his 401k or professional standing, a man in the 50-plus demographic faces a shortened horizon. Studies on the economic consequences of gray divorce suggest that men in this category see their standard of living drop by an average of 21%, while women in the same age bracket see a drop of nearly 45%. However, the men face a unique social poverty. Demographic studies on male loneliness post-divorce show that men over 50 are far more likely to lose their primary social network, which was often maintained by the spouse, leading to higher rates of cardiovascular issues and a decrease in life expectancy compared to their married peers. The transition of the U.S. household is also reflected in the initiation gap. Why do women initiate 70% of divorces? Researchers at Stanford University found that while non-marital breakups are initiated equally by men and women, marital breakups are overwhelmingly female-led. The demographic data points to several potential outcomes. One theory involves the unmet expectations of the modern dual-income household. As women's participation in the labor force has increased, the traditional domestic contract has shifted. Men who do not adapt their domestic roles to match the shifting demographic expectations often find themselves on the receiving end of a filing. Another factor is the safety net evolution. Historically, the demographic reality for women was economic dependence, which served as a deterrent to divorce. With the rise of female professional attainment, the opportunity cost of leaving a marriage has decreased, while the legal framework for alimony and child support has remained, in many states, rooted in a more traditional economic model. We also have to analyze the state line variable. Where a man lives in the United States determines his demographic risk and potential outcome. In community property states like California, Texas, and Arizona, the law generally mandates a 50-50 split of all assets acquired during the marriage. In equitable distribution states like New York or Florida, the court has more discretion to divide property in a way that is fair, but not necessarily equal. Historical trends show that men in equitable distribution states often face more prolonged and expensive litigation because the definition of fair is subjective and prone to intensive legal maneuvering. Data from the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers suggests that legal fees in equitable distribution states can be 30% higher on average than in community property states, simply due to the increased billable hours required to argue for a non-equal split. As we move forward in this series, we will examine the child custody shift. Historically, from the late 19th century until the 1970s, the tender years doctrine presumed that mothers were the primary caregivers, making it demographically rare for men to receive primary or even equal custody. However, census data from the last decade shows a slow but steady increase in shared parenting arrangements. We will look at how this shift is impacting the calculation of child support and the long-term emotional outcomes for children, backed by the latest peer-reviewed studies. We are going to break down the tax trap of divorce, how the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act fundamentally changed the demographic impact of alimony, making it no longer tax-deductible for the payer, which has created a massive, often overlooked financial burden for high-earning men. This is the foundation of our masterclass. We are not here to discuss emotions. We are here to discuss the architecture of the system. The American man in 2026 is operating in a landscape that was built over 50 years of legislative and social evolution. If you are going to navigate it, you must understand the numbers. In the next part, we will dive deep into the specific financial metrics of the initial filing period, and how the first 90 days of a divorce case determine the next 90 months of a man's life. The first 90 days of a divorce proceeding are often referred to by demographic researchers as the window of maximum vulnerability for American men. This period is the statistical epicenter where the trajectory of a man's financial and paternal future is established, often before he has even fully processed the emotional weight of the filing. In the United States in 2026, the legal system relies heavily on the concept of the status quo. This means that whatever financial and domestic patterns exist during these first 3 months will likely be used as the blueprint for the next 7 to 10 years of litigation and support obligations. This is why the first 90 days determine the next 90 months. To understand the financial metrics of this period, we must look at the historical trends of discovery and disclosure. In 2026, the paper trail is no longer a stack of bank statements in a shoebox. It is a live digital ecosystem. When a petition for dissolution is filed, most jurisdictions immediately implement what are known as automatic temporary restraining orders, or ATROs. These are not criminal restraining orders, but rather financial freezes. Imagine if every financial decision you made was suddenly under a microscope, and you were legally prohibited from moving assets, changing beneficiaries on life insurance policies, or selling off stock without a court order or written consent from your spouse. For a man who has managed the household wealth for decades, this sudden loss of agency is a demographic shock. Let us look at a case study involving a character named Mark, a 45-year-old software architect living in a high cost of living area like Seattle or Austin in 2026. Mark earns $300,000 a year. His wife of 15 years files for divorce in January. Within 48 hours, the ATROs are in effect. Mark, thinking he is being prudent, moves $50,000 from a joint savings account to a personal account to ensure he can pay his upcoming legal retainer. Under the current demographic legal standards, this move can be framed as a dissipation of assets or a violation of the financial freeze. Historical trends in family court show that judges increasingly view these preemptive moves with skepticism, potentially leading to the man being ordered to pay the wife's legal fees as a sanction. The first major financial metric Mark faces is the lifestyle analysis. In 2026, forensic accountants use sophisticated software to scrape data from every digital transaction made in the last 5 years. They are looking for the marital standard of living. This calculation is the engine that drives alimony or spousal maintenance. If the data shows that the family spent $15,000 a month on housing, travel, and lifestyle, the court aims to keep both parties as close to that standard as possible. For men, the potential outcome is often the realization that they must now support two households on the same income that previously supported one, while maintaining the same standard for the former spouse. This is where the math of divorce becomes a zero-sum game. Step by step, the first 90 days involve the filing of the schedule of assets and debts, and the income and expense declaration. These documents are the DNA of the case. A common error men make is underestimating their expenses or failing to account for the tax implications of their income in a post-2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act world. Since alimony is no longer tax-deductible for the payer at the federal level, every dollar Mark pays out is post-tax. If he agrees to a temporary support order of $5,000 a month during these first 90 days, he is effectively paying closer to $7,000 when taxes are factored in. Demographic studies show that men who over-leverage themselves in temporary support orders are 60% more likely to experience a significant wealth decline within 5 years of the final decree. Another critical metric is the pendant light or temporary support hearing. This usually happens within the first 60 to 90 days. The danger here is that the temporary order often becomes the permanent order. If a man settles for a high payment just to keep the peace or to maintain access to his children during the initial shock, he is setting a demographic precedent. The court sees the ability to pay for 90 days as proof of the ability to pay for 90 months. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 indicate that once a support level is established, it requires a significant change in circumstances, such as involuntary job loss, to modify it. Voluntary career changes or a desire to reduce stress are rarely accepted as valid reasons for modification in the current legal climate. We must also discuss the concept of imputed income. Imagine if Mark, overwhelmed by the stress of the first 90 days, decides to leave his high-pressure tech job for a lower-paying, more stable role. In 2026, the court can conduct a vocational evaluation. A professional evaluator looks at Mark's education, his work history, and the current labor market data. If they determine that Mark has the capacity to earn $300,000, the judge can impute that income to him. This means Mark's support obligations will be calculated as if he is still making that high salary, regardless of what his actual paycheck says. This creates a financial trap where men are demographically tethered to their highest earning years, often leading to a cycle of debt. The first 90 days also establish the custodial status quo. This is perhaps the most significant demographic shift in recent years. In the 2026 legal landscape, many states have moved toward a rebuttable presumption of 50-50 shared parenting. However, if a man moves out of the family home during the first 90 days without a clearly defined parenting plan in writing, he may inadvertently establish himself as the secondary parent. Demographic data suggests that men who maintain a consistent presence in the home or secure an immediate, enforceable 50-50 temporary schedule are significantly more likely to retain that arrangement in the final settlement. The first 90 days are a race to define who is the primary caregiver in the eyes of the court. Furthermore, the digital footprint in 2026 has introduced a new metric, the social media and communication audit. During the initial filing period, every text message, email, and social media post is discoverable. Historical trends show that men often fall into the trap of high-conflict digital communication during the first 90 days, which is then used in custody evaluations to argue for limited visitation or supervised access. The data is clear. Men who utilize professional communication platforms or strictly adhere to a business-like tone during the initial 90 days see a higher rate of favorable custodial outcomes. This period is not just about the numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about the burn rate of marital assets. Legal fees in the first 90 days can range from $10,000 to over $50,000 depending on the complexity of the estate. When both parties are drawing from the same pool of marital funds to pay competing legal teams, the total net worth of the demographic unit begins to evaporate. Men who fail to understand the cost-benefit analysis of the initial discovery phase often find themselves with a legal bill that exceeds the value of the assets they were trying to protect. By the time the 90-day mark is reached, the battle lines are drawn. The financial disclosures are on the record, the temporary support is flowing, and the parenting schedule is crystallizing. Most men are still in the denial or anger stage of the transition, while the legal and demographic machinery has already moved into the execution phase. This informational gap is what leads to the long-term wealth and health disparities seen in divorced men across the United States. But what happens when the first 90 days are over and the reality of the long-term struggle sets in? There is a specific phenomenon known as the custody cliff that occurs once the temporary orders are finalized. Why do so many men who started with a 50-50 goal end up with every other weekend status by the end of the first year? In the next part, we will explore the demographic data behind the primary parent trap and the specific psychological metrics that the family court system uses to evaluate a man's fitness for shared parenting in 2026. The transition from the initial filing to the long-term reality of shared parenting often centers on a phenomenon known as the primary parent trap. To understand this, we must look at the psychological metrics and demographic data that United States family courts prioritize in 2026. While many states have moved toward a rebuttable presumption of 50-50 custody, the implementation of this remains tethered to the best interest of the child standard, which is inherently subjective and historically biased toward the parent who has performed the majority of daily caregiving tasks. For most men, particularly those in the provider role, this creates an immediate demographic disadvantage that is difficult to overcome once the legal clock starts ticking. Imagine a man named David, a 42-year-old senior manager at a logistics firm in 2026. David has spent the last decade working 50 hours a week to ensure his family could live in a safe neighborhood with access to top-tier schools. In his mind, he has been a fully present father, attending soccer games on weekends and handling the bedtime routine whenever he is home. However, when the divorce petition is filed, David discovers that the court does not measure fatherhood by the quality of the time spent, but by the quantity and the nature of the tasks performed. In the eyes of a custody evaluator or a guardian ad litem, David is not the primary parent. His wife, who may have worked part-time or managed the household, is documented as the one who knows the pediatrician's name, the child's shoe size, and the nuances of the daily school curriculum. This is the heart of the trap. The very labor that David performed to provide for the child's future is used as evidence that he is less capable of managing the child's present. Demographic studies in 2026 show that even as more men desire equal parenting time, the time use data still reflects a significant gap. According to recent longitudinal studies, mothers in the U.S. still spend approximately 40% more time on direct childcare activities than fathers. Family courts use this data to establish what is called the status quo. If the children have spent the last 5 years with one parent as the primary point of contact, the court is statistically inclined to maintain that arrangement to ensure stability. For David, this means that his request for a 50-50 split is viewed not as a right, but as a disruption to the child's existing lifestyle. The evaluation process itself is where the psychological metrics come into play. In 2026, many high-conflict cases trigger a 730 evaluation or a similar court-ordered custody study. This process is exhaustive. A forensic psychologist will conduct a series of interviews with both parents, the children, and collateral contacts like teachers or neighbors. They often utilize standardized psychological testing, such as the MMPI-3, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This test is designed to identify psychopathology, but for men in the middle of a divorce, the greatest risk is the scale that measures defensiveness. Historical trends show that men, feeling attacked or under a microscope, often score high on defensiveness, which evaluators can interpret as a lack of self-awareness or a tendency to minimize personal flaws. This psychological profile can then be used to argue against an equal custody arrangement, favoring the parent who appears more emotionally transparent. Step by step, the custody evaluation examines 12 to 14 specific factors. These include the love, affection, and emotional ties existing between the parties and the child, the capacity and disposition of the parties to provide the child with food, clothing, and medical care, and the length of time the child has lived in a stable, satisfactory environment. For a man like David, the capacity to provide food and clothing is rarely in question, but the capacity to provide the emotional ties and the continuity of care is where the battle is fought. Case studies from 2025 highlight how men who cannot name their child's current teacher or list their allergies are immediately downgraded in the eyes of the evaluator, regardless of their income or the quality of the home they provide. Furthermore, we must address the friendly parent doctrine. This is a demographic and legal concept that rewards the parent who is most likely to foster a healthy relationship between the child and the other parent. In 2026, technology has become the primary witness in this category. Co-parenting applications such as Talking Parents or Our Family Wizard are now routinely ordered by the court. Every message sent is a permanent, time-stamped piece of evidence. Men who react out of frustration to a perceived slight or a missed visitation window are creating a digital trail that evaluators use to label them as high conflict. The potential outcome is a reduction in parenting time, under the theory that the man's presence creates a toxic environment that is not in the best interest of the child. Another layer of the trap involves the vocational impact. If a man successfully secures 50-50 custody, he must then reconcile his career with his new domestic reality. In 2026, the workplace has theoretically become more flexible, but demographic data suggests that men who take paternity leave or utilize flexible hours for childcare still face a promotion penalty. For a divorced father, this creates a secondary financial crisis. He needs the high income to pay child support and maintain a second home for the children, but the requirements of 50-50 custody may prevent him from working the hours necessary to sustain that income. This is why many men eventually slide down the custody cliff. They start with an equal split but within 2 years, find themselves reverting to an every other weekend schedule simply because the logistics of modern professional life in the United States are not yet fully compatible with the requirements of a primary caregiving father. Consider the scenario of James, a shift worker in the energy sector. James wants to be a 50-50 father, but his schedule involves rotating shifts. In a demographic study of blue-collar fathers, researchers found that these men are the most likely to lose custody because their schedules are deemed unstable by the court. The court prefers a fixed, predictable routine. If the mother has a traditional 9-to-5 job or stays at home, James is seen as the less desirable custodian, despite his desire to be present. This systemic bias toward a specific type of professional stability often leaves men in trade industries on the outside looking in. The implications of this are not just social, they are profoundly financial. In the US, child support is almost always a function of two variables: the income gap between the parents and the percentage of time each parent spends with the child. Every percentage point a man loses in the custody battle translates directly into an increased monthly payment. This creates a perverse incentive structure where custody becomes a proxy for financial negotiation. Demographic data indicates that in contested cases, for every 10% increase in a father's parenting time, his child support obligation can decrease by significant margins, depending on the state's specific formula. This turns the nursery into a courtroom. As we look at the data for 2026, we see a growing movement of men who are attempting to bypass the primary parent trap by becoming the primary caregiver years before a divorce is ever on the horizon. They are engaging in what sociologists call preemptive parenting. But for the millions of men already in the system, the challenge is navigating a machine that was built on a foundation of 20th century gender roles. The psychological metrics are shifting, but the historical weight of the status quo remains a formidable barrier. Custody is only one half of the equation. Once the parenting schedule is set, the court turns its attention to the most complex mathematical exercise in family law: the division of the marital estate and the calculation of the long-term support. Why do men who have built multimillion-dollar companies often find themselves with less than 30% of the total net worth after the dust settles? In the next part, we will break down the demographic reality of asset erosion and the specific math of spousal maintenance in 2026, including the hidden tax liabilities that catch even the most successful men off guard. The transition from the custody phase to the financial liquidation of a long-term marriage is often where the demographic reality of asset erosion hits the hardest. For American men in 2026, the concept of a 50-50 split is largely an illusion once transactional friction and tax liabilities are calculated. In this demographic masterclass, we have to look at the cold math of the marital estate. When a court orders a division of assets, it is dividing the gross value, but the man is often left navigating the net reality. Imagine a man named Michael, a 52-year-old business owner in Florida in 2026. Michael has been married for 25 years, placing him in the long-term marriage category under the 2023 Florida alimony reforms. The marital home is valued at $800,000 with a mortgage of $300,000, leaving $500,000 in equity. To the casual observer, Michael and his spouse each have $250,000. However, the demographic data on residential liquidation shows a different outcome. To realize that equity, the house must be sold or one party must buy the other out. In a sale, Michael faces 6% in realtor commissions, which is $48,000. Add in $10,000 for pre-sale repairs and $5,000 for staging and closing costs. The $500,000 in equity has already eroded to $437,000 before a single tax is paid. This brings us to the first major financial metric, the capital gains trap. In 2026, the tax landscape has shifted following the sunset of many provisions from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. If Michael and his spouse sell the home while still legally married, they can exclude $500,000 of gain from their federal income tax. However, if the timing of the divorce decree precedes the sale of the asset, each party only receives a $250,000 exclusion. If the home has appreciated significantly over 25 years, Michael could find himself paying 20% in capital gains tax on a portion of his half of the equity simply because the legal paperwork was finalized too early. This is what researchers call timing-based asset erosion, where a lack of demographic and tax coordination results in a five-figure loss for the man. Step by step, we must then analyze the spousal maintenance or alimony calculation, which has become a primary driver of male wealth decline in 2026. Under the current Florida statutes, which many other states are now mirroring to reduce litigation, permanent alimony has been eliminated. For Michael, a 25-year marriage means he faces durational alimony for a maximum of 75% of the marriage's length, or 18.75 years. The critical metric here is the 35% cap. Alimony cannot exceed 35% of the difference between the spouse's net monthly incomes. Plus 2. If Michael earns $300,000 a year and his spouse has been a stay-at-home parent with zero income, the math appears straightforward: $105,000 a year in alimony. But here is the deep-dive reality that catches successful men off guard: the post-AJA tax inversion. Because alimony is no longer tax-deductible for the payer at the federal level, Michael must pay that $105,000 out of his post-tax income. In the 2026 tax environment, with Michael now filing as a single individual in a higher bracket, his $300,000 gross income might only yield $210,000 in net take-home pay after federal, state, and payroll taxes. When he then pays out $105,000 in alimony, he is left with $105,000 for his own household. Meanwhile, his former spouse receives that $105,000 completely tax-free. Statistically, the wife now has a higher net standard of living than the husband who is generating the income, as she has zero professional expenses and a lower individual tax liability on any supplemental income she might earn. Now let us look at the most complex asset in Michael's estate: his business. In 2026, business valuation in divorce has moved beyond simple book value. Forensic evaluators use the fair market value standard, often employing an income-based approach that capitalizes the business's earnings. If Michael's business generates $200,000 in annual profit, an evaluator might apply a multiple of 4, valuing the company at $800,000. Michael must then buy out his spouse's half interest for $400,000. This leads to the phenomenon of the double dip, a major point of contention in modern demographic studies of male business owners. The double dip occurs when the same stream of income is used twice by the court. First, the $200,000 in business profit is used to value the asset at $800,000, for which Michael must pay a settlement. Second, that same $200,000 is used as Michael's income to calculate his alimony and child support obligations. Effectively, Michael is paying his spouse for the right to keep his income, and then paying her a percentage of that same income every month. While some states have implemented case law to prevent this, the data shows that in equitable distribution jurisdictions, judges often struggle to separate the two, leading to a significant redistribution of the man's future labor. Furthermore, we must account for the professional and enterprise goodwill distinction. In 2026, courts are increasingly looking at whether the value of a business resides in the brand, known as enterprise goodwill, or in the individual man himself, known as professional goodwill. If Michael is a consultant or a surgeon, much of the business value is professional goodwill, which in many states is considered separate property and not subject to division. However, if the business has a staff, a recurring client base, and a recognized brand name, it is classified as enterprise goodwill and is fully divisible. Men who fail to conduct a rigorous goodwill analysis during the valuation phase often end up splitting the value of their own reputation, a demographic outcome that is nearly impossible to reverse. The cumulative effect of these metrics is what sociologists call the wealth shock of the middle-aged man. By the time Michael pays the legal fees, the forensic accountants, the vocational evaluators, and the equalization payment for his business, his liquid net worth is often depleted. He is left with an illiquid asset, his company, and a massive long-term monthly obligation that must be met regardless of market fluctuations or his own health. This is why demographic studies show that divorced men in their 50s are significantly more likely to delay retirement compared to their married or never married peers. They are demographically tethered to the treadmill of high-performance labor to service the debt created by the dissolution. We also have to consider the QDRO, or Qualified Domestic Relations Order. When Michael's retirement accounts are divided, the court issues a QDRO to split his 401k or pension. In 2026, the administrative costs and the potential for market volatility during the period between the decree and the actual transfer of funds can result in further erosion. If the market dips 10% during the 60 days it takes for the plan administrator to process the QDRO, Michael may still be liable for the dollar amount specified in the decree, effectively absorbing the entire market loss on the spouse's behalf. As the financial dust settles, the man is not just poorer. He is entering a new demographic category with its own set of risks. The transition from a dual-income or high-asset household to a single-payer household creates a vulnerability that goes beyond the bank account. It affects his ability to remarry, his social standing, and his long-term physical health. But what happens when the financial settlement is signed and the man tries to rebuild? There is a second, often more invisible wave of divorce that the data is just starting to reveal. Why is it that second marriages for men have a 60% failure rate, and third marriages climb to over 70%? In the next part, we will explore the demographic data behind the remarriage trap, and why the financial and psychological baggage of the first divorce often creates a self-fulfilling prophecy for the second. We will look at the case studies of men who tried to replace what they lost, only to find themselves in an even more precarious demographic position. The precarious demographic position of a man entering a second or third marriage is often underestimated because of a psychological phenomenon researchers call the optimism bias. In the United States in 2026, the data from the National Center for Health Statistics reveals a sobering reality. While first marriages have a roughly 40 to 50% failure rate, second marriages fail at a rate of 60 to 67%, and third marriages collapse at a staggering 73%. To understand why the sequel is often more financially and emotionally devastating than the original, we must look at the compounding variables of support obligations, asset commingling, and the psychological metrics of the rebound. Imagine a man named Stephen, a 54-year-old executive in the healthcare sector in 2026. Stephen finalized his first divorce 2 years ago. He navigated the asset erosion we discussed in the previous part, losing nearly half of his retirement savings and a significant portion of the equity in his family home. He currently pays $4,000 a month in durational alimony. Feeling the demographic weight of loneliness and the desire to rebuild the domestic stability he spent 30 years cultivating, Stephen meets a woman who is also divorced and has 2 children of her own. Within 18 months, they decide to marry. Stephen believes he is making a choice based on experience and maturity, But the demographic data suggests he is entering a high-stakes financial intersection. The first metric of the remarriage trap is the stacking of obligations. In 2026, the tax implications of Stephen's first divorce are already exerting pressure on his cash flow. Because his alimony is not tax-deductible, he has to earn roughly $7,000 in gross income just to cover that $4,000 monthly payment to his first wife. When he enters the second marriage, he often assumes a shared income model. However, if this second marriage fails, Stephen is not just looking at a second round of asset division, he is looking at a cumulative depletion. In many jurisdictions, the court will look at Stephen's remaining income after his first alimony payment is made to determine his ability to pay a second alimony or child support obligation. This is the phenomenon of the diminishing return of the male provider. By the time the second legal machinery finishes its work, Stephen could be living on less than 25% of his gross earnings. Step by step, the failure of second marriages often follows a predictable demographic path. First, there is the issue of asset commingling. In his second marriage, Stephen and his new spouse, let us call her Elena, decide to buy a new home in 2026. Stephen uses the remaining $200,000 from his first divorce settlement as a down payment. Over the next 5 years, they use their joint income to pay the mortgage and renovate the kitchen. Under the legal standards of most equitable distribution states, that $200,000 of separate property has now become marital property through the process of transmutation. Stephen has effectively gifted half of his remaining survival fund to the second marital estate. When the second divorce filing occurs, the court does not give Stephen a credit for the initial down payment, unless he has a meticulously drafted and executed prenuptial agreement that specifically carves out that asset. Historical trends show that men in second marriages often skip the prenuptial process because they do not want to start the relationship on a note of distrust, unaware that they are demographically doubling down on their risk. Furthermore, we must analyze the blended family dynamic, which is a primary driver of divorce in the 50-plus demographic. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 indicate that conflict over the allocation of resources to children from previous marriages is a leading cause of marital dissolution. If Stephen wants to pay for his biological daughter's graduate school or assist his son with a down payment on a house, Elena may view this as a diversion of marital funds that should be spent on their current household or her own children. This creates a demographic tug-of-war. The data shows that men in these scenarios often experience higher levels of cortisol and stress-related health issues as they attempt to balance competing loyalties. In 2026, with the high cost of living and the sunsetting of various tax benefits, the financial margin for error is razor-thin. A man's failure to prioritize one set of children over the other often leads to a breakdown in the second marriage's foundational trust. There is also the matter of the inheritance and estate trap. In 2026, as the baby boomer and Gen X generations facilitate the largest transfer of wealth in human history, the legal fight between second wives and children from the first marriage has become a demographic staple in probate courts. If Stephen dies while married to Elena without a complex trust structure, Elena may be entitled to an elective share of his estate, even if Stephen intended for his children to be the primary beneficiaries. This reality often leads to a chilling of the relationship between the father and his biological children during the second marriage, as the children realize their future inheritance is being demographically rerouted. This social isolation is a key metric in the decline of long-term health outcomes for divorced and remarried men. Why do men rush into this trap? Demographic studies suggest it is partly due to the domestic routine gap. Men are statistically more likely than women to rely on a spouse for social networking, health management, and domestic logistics. After a divorce, a man often finds himself in a vacuum. The desire to fill that vacuum leads to a compressed courtship period. Data from the Pew Research Center suggests that the shorter the courtship before a second marriage, the higher the probability of a subsequent divorce. Men are often looking for a replacement for the role of the spouse, rather than a partner for a new life, which leads to a mismatch in expectations. In 2026, the potential outcomes for men who do not protect themselves in second marriages are becoming increasingly dire. With the rise of digital assets and complex retirement vehicles, the process of untangling a second marriage is often more expensive than the first because it involves three parties: the man, the second wife, and the ghost of the first marriage's financial obligations. Forensic accountants in 2026 are seeing an increase in cases where a man's second divorce is actually triggered by the financial strain caused by the first. It is a domino effect that leaves the man at age 60 or 65 with no path toward the retirement he spent 40 years funding. This brings us to the concept of the prenuptial renaissance. In 2026, we are seeing a demographic shift where middle-income men are finally adopting the protections once reserved for the ultra-wealthy. These modern agreements are not just about who gets the house. They are about protecting the ability to pay the first wife's alimony, ensuring children from the first marriage are not disinherited, and defining exactly what constitutes marital versus separate property in an era of fluctuating market values. Men who utilize these tools are statistically more likely to sustain their second marriages, because the financial expectations are transparent from day one. The reality of the remarriage trap is that the system is not designed to support multiple households from a single income stream. The demographic data is a warning. The second time around, the margin for error is non-existent. A man must be a mathematician first and a romantic second if he wants to survive the transition without losing everything. But the financial and legal traps are only part of the story. There is a silent crisis that the demographic data is only now beginning to quantify. It is a crisis that does not show up in a bank statement, but appears in the actuarial tables of life expectancy. Why is it that divorced men in the US have a significantly higher mortality rate than their married or even widowed counterparts? In the next part, we will explore the demographic link between divorce and the male health collapse. We will look at the data on social isolation, the loss of health advocates, and the specific biological markers that shift when a man loses his domestic anchor in 2026. We will examine why the most dangerous thing a man can do for his long-term survival is to lose his family unit without a robust secondary support system in place. The statistical link between the dissolution of a marriage and the physical decline of the American male is one of the most documented, yet least discussed variables in modern demographic studies. In 2026, the data indicates that divorced men have a mortality rate that is nearly 250% higher than that of married men. This is not merely a psychological or emotional phenomenon. It is an actuarial reality that shows up in insurance premiums and life expectancy tables across the United States. To understand why losing a domestic anchor is the most dangerous event in a man's life cycle, we must look at the biological markers and the collapse of what sociologists call the informal health advocacy network. Imagine a man named Thomas, a 50-year-old project manager living in Ohio in 2026. Thomas has just finalized his divorce after 22 years. During his marriage, his wife acted as the uncredited chief health officer of the household. This is a common demographic trend. Women are statistically more likely to schedule medical appointments, monitor dietary intake, and notice early-stage symptoms of chronic issues in their partners. When Thomas enters his post-divorce life, this health advocacy network vanishes overnight. In his first year of being single, Thomas is 60% less likely to visit a primary care physician for a routine checkup. Historical trends suggest that without a spouse to prompt a screening, Thomas will likely ignore minor symptoms of hypertension or high cholesterol until they manifest as a major cardiovascular event. The biological reality of the transition is even more startling when we look at cortisol levels and systemic inflammation. Demographic studies in 2026 utilize high-resolution biomarker tracking to show that divorced men experience a sustained elevation in baseline cortisol. This is not just a temporary spike from the stress of the legal proceedings. It is a chronic, low-grade physiological state that researchers call the separation stress response. This elevated cortisol acts as a corrosive agent on the cardiovascular system. Data from longitudinal health studies indicates that men who undergo a divorce in their 50s see an immediate increase in C-reactive protein, a primary marker for systemic inflammation. Step by step, this leads to a hardening of the arteries and a significantly higher risk of myocardial infarction within the first 5 years of the decree. For Thomas, the loss of his wife's presence is not just a change in his living situation. It is a direct assault on his cellular health. Furthermore, we must examine the friendship gap. Demographic studies in the United States show that men are disproportionately reliant on their wives for social connectivity. When a marriage ends, the man often discovers that 70% of his social circle was actually maintained through his wife's efforts. In 2026, this leads to a phenomenon known as social atrophy. While women tend to have robust, non-familial support networks, men often find themselves in a social vacuum. This isolation is not just a matter of feeling lonely. It is a health risk. The U.S. Surgeon General's 2023 report, which has been echoed in 2026 data, compares social isolation to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of its impact on mortality. For a man like Thomas, the lack of a secondary support system, friends he can talk to about his situation, family members who check in daily, means that he has no buffer against the psychological toll of the transition. This isolation often leads to a demographic shift in substance use. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 show a sharp incline in alcohol consumption and the use of prescription sleep aids among recently divorced men. Without the domestic accountability of a partner, many men fall into a pattern of self-medication to deal with the silence of a secondary household. Data suggests that men who live alone post-divorce are 4 times more likely to struggle with substance dependency than married men in the same age bracket. This creates a feedback loop. The substance use further degrades the man's health, which in turn makes him less likely to engage socially, deepening the isolation and increasing the mortality risk. Another critical metric is the nutritional decline. In 2026, the rise of ultra-processed food and delivery apps has made it easier than ever for a single man to abandon a healthy diet. Demographic studies on the grocery habits of divorced men show a significant decrease in the consumption of fresh vegetables and lean proteins compared to their married years. Thomas, who used to eat home-cooked meals 5 nights a week, now relies on high-sodium takeout and microwavable meals. The resulting weight gain and metabolic shift further exacerbate his cardiovascular risk. This is the step-by-step unraveling of a man's physical foundation. When you combine the lack of medical screenings, the elevation of cortisol, the social isolation, and the nutritional collapse, the result is a demographic profile that is uniquely vulnerable to premature death. But there is also a secondary, more invisible danger: the loss of the purpose-driven life. In many demographic surveys conducted in 2026, men report that their primary sense of purpose was tied to their role as a provider and protector within the family unit. When that unit is dismantled, even if they still have shared custody of their children, the man faces a crisis of utility. He no longer has a domestic territory to defend or a daily structure to support. This loss of purpose has a direct correlation with telomere shortening, the protective caps at the end of our chromosomes. Studies on cellular aging show that men who report a low sense of purpose post-divorce age at a rate nearly 30% faster than those who maintain a strong sense of mission. For Thomas, his work as a project manager may provide a paycheck, but it doesn't provide the same biological motivation as the role of the patriarch. To mitigate these potential outcomes, the data points to the necessity of a robust secondary support system. Men who successfully navigate the health collapse are those who intentionally rebuild their social capital. They join community organizations, they engage in regular physical exercise with a group, and they utilize modern health tracking technology to replace the advocacy of a spouse. In 2026, we are seeing the emergence of male-focused health cooperatives, groups of divorced men who hold each other accountable for doctor visits, diet, and mental health check-ins. These case studies show that when a man treats his health as a project with a defined roadmap, he can blunt the impact of the demographic divorce penalty. The most dangerous thing a man can do is to assume he is fine because he is going to the gym or because he still has a job. The data is clear. The internal biological shift happens regardless of outward appearances. Without a domestic anchor, the man is a ship in a storm without a keel. Every stressor hits harder, every illness lasts longer, and the long-term outlook is fundamentally altered. This is why the first year post-divorce is not just a legal and financial hurdle. It is a biological survival gauntlet. The transition of the male demographic in the U.S. is not just about the body, it is about the professional and social trajectory. While the health collapse is the most immediate risk, there is a secondary erosion that occurs in the professional sphere. Why is it that divorced men, despite having more free time than married fathers, often see a stagnation or decline in their career earnings over a 5-year period? In the next part, we will explore the demographic data behind the divorce wage gap, and the specific ways in which the loss of a domestic partner impacts a man's professional performance, focus, and long-term earning potential in 2026. We will look at how the disappearance of the domestic support staff, the spouse who managed the laundry, the meals, and the calendar, forces a man into a state of cognitive overload that sabotages his climb up the corporate ladder. The common misconception in the United States, especially as we move through 2026, is that a man who emerges from a divorce suddenly finds himself with an abundance of free time. The theory suggests that without a spouse and with only partial custody of children, his professional output should skyrocket. However, demographic studies and labor statistics tell a diametrically opposed story. we are observing the emergence of the divorce wage gap, a phenomenon where men's career trajectories often flatten or even dip significantly following the dissolution of a long-term marriage. This is not due to a lack of ambition or a sudden desire for leisure. It is the direct result of a massive, unquantified loss of domestic infrastructure. When the domestic support staff, traditionally the spouse who managed the invisible labor of the household, disappears, the man is thrust into a state of cognitive overload that acts as a silent tax on his professional performance. To understand this, we must look at the historical trends of the marriage premium. For decades, demographic data has shown that married men earn between 10 and 40% more than their single peers. While some of this is attributed to selection bias, the idea that high-earning men are more likely to marry, a significant portion is tied to the efficiency of a dual-role household. In this model, the man is able to dedicate 100% of his executive function to his career because the complex logistics of life are handled. In 2026, those logistics have only become more complicated. Imagine a man named Brian, a 44-year-old director of operations for a logistics firm in Chicago. Before his divorce, Brian's life was an optimized machine. His calendar was managed, his dry cleaning appeared in his closet, his children's medical records were up to date, and his social obligations, the vital networking that sustains a high-level career, were curated and maintained by his wife. When the divorce was finalized in early 2026, Brian gained 50% of his time back on paper through a shared parenting agreement, but in reality, he lost his entire support department. Brian now faces what researchers call the bandwidth tax. Every morning, instead of reviewing his morning brief or preparing for a high-stakes board meeting, Brian is navigating the logistical minefield of a single-parent household. He is tracking down lost soccer cleats, managing the digital school portal that sends 40 notifications a day, and trying to remember if it is his week to provide snacks for the classroom. This is the third shift. It is the administrative burden of existence. Demographic studies in 2026 indicate that the average divorced man in a professional role spends an additional 15 to 20 hours per week on domestic administration that he previously did not even see. This cognitive load is not just about time, it is about decision fatigue. By the time Brian sits down at his desk at 9 a.m., he has already made dozens of logistical decisions. His capacity for the high-level, creative problem-solving required in his role is already depleted. This leads to a measurable decline in professional presenteeism. Brian is physically at his desk, but his mind is frequently occupied by the friction of his new reality. He is worrying about the refrigerator repairman who is supposed to arrive between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m., or he is fielding calls from a child who forgot their lunch. Case studies of men in Brian's position show that they are 30% less likely to volunteer for high-visibility, high-stress projects in the 2 years following a divorce. They are in survival mode, attempting to keep their head above water domestically, which leads to them being passed over for promotions. The potential outcome is a career plateau at the very moment they should be entering their peak earning years. Furthermore, we must look at the collapse of the networking and travel advantage. In the 2026 global economy, the ability to be mobile is a primary currency. Before his divorce, Brian could jump on a plane for a last-minute client meeting in London because the domestic front was covered. Now, with a strict 50-50 custody schedule, Brian's mobility is slashed by half. He cannot travel during his weeks with the children, and even on his off weeks, he is often too exhausted or bogged down by the backlog of household maintenance to engage in the after-hours networking that drives executive advancement. Demographic data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that divorced men in their 40s and 50s travel 40% less for work than their married counterparts. In a competitive corporate environment, this lack of visibility is career suicide. The financial impact of this is compounded by the fact that the cost of outsourcing this domestic labor is prohibitive. To replace the labor of a spouse, Brian would need to hire a personal assistant, a housekeeper, a meal prep service, and a part-time nanny. In 2026, the market rate for this level of support in a major U.S. city exceeds $60,000 a year in post-tax income. For most men, this is simply not an option, especially when they are already paying spousal or child support. They are forced to perform the labor themselves, sacrificing the very focus they need to increase their income to cover their new expenses. It is a demographic feedback loop of professional stagnation. Historical trends also point to the psychological metric of the professional identity crisis. For many American men, their identity is inextricably linked to their role as a provider for a specific family unit. When that unit is fractured, the motivation to grind for the next title often evaporates. If the extra $50,000 a year in a potential raise will largely be diverted to alimony or legal fees, the incentive to put in the 80-hour weeks disappears. We are seeing a demographic shift where divorced men are choosing to downshift their careers, prioritizing stability and lower stress over the climb up the corporate ladder. This choice, while healthy in the short term, has devastating long-term consequences for their wealth accumulation and retirement readiness. Step by step, the professional erosion happens in small increments. It is the missed early morning meeting because of a childcare conflict. It is the decreased participation in optional professional development. It is the subtle withdrawal from the office culture. Over a 5-year period, these increments add up to a significant wage gap. Recent studies comparing divorced men to their married peers with similar education and experience levels show a 7 to 12% difference in total compensation within 5 years of the decree. As we look at the data for the remainder of 2026, the conclusion is clear. The divorce penalty for men is not just about the check written to a former spouse. It is about the invisible ceiling created by the loss of domestic infrastructure. The man who was once a high-performance athlete in the corporate world is now running a marathon with a backpack full of domestic stones. He is working harder than ever, but he is moving slower. But the workplace is only one arena where the divorced man's influence and identity are challenged. There is a secondary, perhaps more profound loss that occurs in the social and communal spheres. Why is it that men, who often feel a sense of relief in the immediate aftermath of a divorce, find themselves in a deep state of social isolation 3 years later? In the next part, we will explore the demographic data on the social ghosting of the divorced man. We will look at how social circles in the United States are often built around couples, and what happens to the man when he is no longer part of that demographic unit. We will examine the case studies of men who lost not just a wife, but their entire community, and the specific ways this isolation impacts their long-term mental health and sense of belonging in a society that is increasingly disconnected. The social ghosting of the divorced man is not a mere byproduct of personal friction. It is a measurable demographic trend that reflects the couple-centric architecture of American society in 2026. When a marriage of 10, 20, or 30 years dissolves, the man does not just lose a partner. He often loses the entire social infrastructure that sustained his identity outside of work. In the United States, social capital is frequently managed by women. Demographic studies consistently show that in the majority of heterosexual unions, the wife acts as the primary social architect. She is the one who maintains contact with the extended family, schedules dinners with other couples, manages the holiday cards, and keeps the pulse of the neighborhood. When the divorce decree is finalized, this entire system is effectively unplugged for the man. He is left with what researchers call social atrophy, a state where his community ties wither away not through malice, but through the sheer lack of maintenance. To understand the mechanics of this, imagine a man named James, a 52-year-old insurance executive living in a suburban enclave in North Carolina in 2026. James has been part of the same social circle for 15 years. This circle consists of 4 other couples who vacation together, celebrate birthdays, and share a weekly standing reservation at a local restaurant. This community felt like a family. However, within 6 months of his divorce, James finds himself on the outside looking in. This is the first step of the social ghosting process, the selection bias of the couple-centric group. In 2026, the potential outcomes for a single man in a group of couples are often awkwardness and exclusion. The group's activities, double dates, family-oriented barbecues, and gendered social outings, are designed for pairs. As a single man, James represents a disruption to the established equilibrium. He is no longer part of the conversation about home renovations or shared child-rearing struggles in the same way. Demographic data indicates that within 2 years of a divorce, men lose an average of 50 to 60% of their shared social network. Historical trends show that this exclusion is often driven by the narrative gap. In a divorce, there is rarely a shared story. There is the wife's version and the husband's version. Because women typically have deeper, more communicative relationships with the other wives in the social circle, her narrative often becomes the group's official history. James, who has spent decades being taught to keep his domestic struggles private, often remains silent. This silence is frequently interpreted by the community as a lack of interest or worse, as a silent admission of guilt. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 highlight that men who do not actively work to secure their own independent social ties during the marriage find themselves in a state of total social isolation within 12 months of moving out of the family home. The second major demographic loss is the in-law network. For many men, the spouse's family becomes their primary extended family. After 20 years of marriage, the brothers-in-law, sisters-in-law, and parents-in-law are not just relatives by marriage, they are the man's closest friends and mentors. In the 2026 legal and social climate, this network is almost always severed instantly. This creates a demographic void that is rarely discussed. While a woman might maintain contact with her former in-laws for the sake of the children, men are statistically more likely to be completely cut off. For James, losing his father-in-law's mentorship and his brother-in-law's camaraderie is a secondary divorce that carries its own heavy psychological price. He is effectively an orphan in his own community. Step by step, the erasure of the man's social footprint also occurs in what sociologists call the third place: the church, the gym, the country club, or the local hobby group. In 2026, many of these spaces have become increasingly polarized or specialized. If James and his wife were prominent members of a local church, the social pressure to choose sides is immense. Demographic studies on religious affiliation post-divorce show that men are 3 times more likely than women to stop attending their place of worship altogether after a separation. This is not necessarily because they have lost their faith, but because the social cost of attending a space where they are now seen as a failure or a visitor is too high. This results in the loss of a vital support system that provides moral, emotional, and sometimes financial stability during the transition. This isolation leads to the most dangerous metric in the 2026 demographic data: the surge in what researchers call deaths of despair among divorced men. The mortality rate for divorced men is significantly influenced by this social ghosting. Without a community to provide accountability and emotional outlet, men are more susceptible to severe depression and anxiety. According to the latest longitudinal studies, the risk of suicide for divorced men in the United States is nearly 10 times higher than that of divorced women. This is a direct reflection of the narrative and community gap. While women are socialized to seek out support groups, therapy, and new social circles, men like James are often left with the stoic expectation to just deal with it. This stoicism, combined with social isolation, creates a toxic internal environment that manifests in declining physical health and mental stability. Furthermore, we must address the digital ghosting that occurs in 2026. The algorithm of modern life is designed to show us what it thinks we want to see. When James's social circle stops interacting with his posts, or when he is removed from group chats, the digital platforms he relies on for connection begin to hide his former life from him, and hide him from his former life. This creates a digital echo chamber of isolation. He sees his former friends continuing their vacations and celebrations through the lens of his ex-wife's social media, while he is physically and digitally excluded. The potential outcome is a state of chronic hypervigilance, and a feeling of being a ghost in his own town. The loss of the domestic anchor also impacts the man's sense of belonging. In 2026, the concept of home is not just a building. It is a social hub. When James moves into a luxury apartment or a smaller rental, he realizes that he is no longer a host. He is now a guest in other people's lives. The demographics of the bachelor life in middle age are often characterized by a lack of invitation. Men who do not have a home that functions as a social center are less likely to be invited to other people's centers. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle of withdrawal. To combat this, case studies of men who survive this social ghosting point to the necessity of building an intentional, male-only or hobby-based community. Men who join veteran groups, sports leagues, or professional associations that are not couple-oriented see a 40% higher rate of psychological recovery. However, the effort required to build these ties from scratch at age 50 is immense, especially when the man is already dealing with the professional and financial erosion we discussed in previous parts. As the social dust settles, the man often finds that his entire identity, which was once anchored in being a husband, a father, and a community member, has been stripped down to its barest components. This leads to a profound question of purpose. But there is one more legal and financial hurdle that determines whether a man can ever truly rebuild his life. Beyond the assets in the house, the long-term reality of the child support and alimony enforcement system. Why is it that in 2026, a man's financial obligation can increase even if his income remains stagnant? In the next part, we will explore the demographic reality of the perpetual payer and the specific ways in which the U.S. legal system handles the long-term enforcement of support. We will look at the case studies of men who found themselves in a state of permanent economic subordination, and how the threat of incarceration or license revocation shapes the remaining years of a man's life. The state of permanent economic subordination is not a poetic exaggeration. In the 2026 American legal landscape, it is a structured, institutionalized reality. When a man transitions from a husband to a payer, his relationship with the United States government changes fundamentally. He is no longer just a citizen. He is a primary source of revenue for the Title 4D child support enforcement system. This system, established by the Social Security Act, creates a powerful administrative machinery designed to ensure that the financial obligations established during the divorce are met with military precision. For many men, this marks the beginning of a decades-long interaction with state agencies that have the power to monitor their bank accounts, seize their professional licenses, and even restrict their physical freedom. Imagine a man named Brandon, a 48-year-old senior sales executive living in Pennsylvania in 2026. Brandon's divorce decree was finalized 3 years ago, mandating that he pay $5,000 a month in a combination of child support and durational alimony. At the time of the decree, Brandon was earning $250,000 a year. However, in the shifting economic climate of 2026, Brandon's company undergoes a restructuring, and his commission-based income drops by 30%. Brandon is now in a situation where his fixed legal obligations consume nearly 60% of his take-home pay. This is where the demographic reality of the perpetual payer begins. The first institutional hurdle Brandon faces is the Bradley Amendment. This federal law, which has been a cornerstone of the U.S. support system for decades, prohibits the retroactive reduction of child support arrears. Step by step, if Brandon misses a payment in June because he is between commissions, that debt becomes a vested judgment by operation of law. Even if he goes to court in August and successfully proves that his income has dropped, the judge generally cannot reduce the amount he owed for June and July. This creates a demographic debt trap. Historical trends show that men who experience even a temporary interruption in income often find themselves in a state of permanent delinquency because the interest rates on support arrears in many states range from 6 to 10% annually. In 2026, with the cost of living remaining high, a man who falls 3 months behind may find it mathematically impossible to catch up while also meeting current obligations. Furthermore, we must examine the income withholding order or IWO. In 2026, the domestic support obligation is not something Brandon pays voluntarily. It is garnished directly from his paycheck. The state disbursement unit acts as the middleman. For Brandon, this means his employer is intimately aware of his domestic financial struggles. Demographic studies on professional perception indicate that men with high-level garnishments are often viewed as high-risk or less stable by corporate leadership. This is a secondary professional penalty. When Brandon applies for a new role, the IWO follows him. The administrative burden on the new employer's payroll department is an invisible mark against his candidacy. The potential outcome is that Brandon becomes tethered to his current employer, fearing that a move will trigger a recalculation or a period of non-payment that leads to enforcement actions. What happens when Brandon cannot meet the full obligation? In 2026, the enforcement toolkit is more integrated than ever before. The first trigger is usually the automated flagging of his driver's license. Nearly every state in the U.S. utilizes license suspension as a primary collection tool. The demographic irony is profound. To pay the support, Brandon needs to work. To work in 2026, he likely needs to drive. If the state suspends his license for non-payment, Brandon is forced into a state of legal jeopardy. If he drives to work to earn the money to pay the debt, he risks arrest for driving on a suspended license. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 show a significant number of men entering the criminal justice system through this specific door. Once a man has a criminal record for a driving offense, his professional mobility, the very thing he needs to satisfy the debt, is further compromised. The enforcement reaches into every corner of Brandon's life. In 2026, the passport denial program is strictly enforced for anyone owing more than $2,500 in arrears. Brandon, whose sales role occasionally requires international travel to visit manufacturers in Southeast Asia, finds himself grounded. His inability to travel leads to a further decline in his performance, which leads to a further decline in his income. This is the spiral of economic subordination. Additionally, the state has the power to intercept Brandon's federal and state tax refunds, seize funds directly from his bank accounts through administrative liens, and place a cloud on the title of any real estate he might try to purchase. He is demographically excluded from the traditional paths of wealth accumulation. The ultimate enforcement tool is civil contempt of court. In the United States, while we theoretically abolished debtors' prisons in the 19th century, the family court system maintains the power of incarceration for the willful failure to pay support. In 2026, the burden of proof often shifts to the man to prove that he does not have the present ability to pay. If Brandon cannot provide a meticulous accounting of every dollar spent, a judge can find him in contempt and order him to be held in the county jail until a purge amount is paid. Historical trends in jurisdictions like South Carolina and Georgia show that thousands of men are incarcerated annually for support-related contempt. The demographic data suggests that these men are disproportionately from lower and middle-income brackets, where the lack of liquid assets makes paying a $5,000 or $10,000 purge amount an impossibility. Beyond the legal threats, there is the psychological metric of the subordinated life. In 2026, Brandon lives with the constant awareness that he is one administrative error or one bad sales quarter away from a total life collapse. This creates a state of chronic hypervigilance. He cannot save for his own retirement because every extra dollar is viewed as potential support that could be captured. He cannot remarry or start a new family without the constant fear that his new spouse's income will be factored into his household ability to pay, a trend we are seeing in several state-level legislative proposals. He is, in the most literal sense, a passenger in his own financial life. Demographic studies on the long-term poverty risk for men post-divorce highlight this reality. While the immediate aftermath of a divorce often shows a decline in a woman's standard of living, the long-term data for men shows a flatter, more prolonged struggle. Men who are perpetual payers in their 50s often enter their 60s with zero net worth and a continued legal obligation that may last until the youngest child finishes college or, in the case of permanent-style alimony in certain states, until the payer's death or the recipient's remarriage. In 2026, as the age of retirement moves higher, these men are the ones who cannot afford to stop working. They are the demographic heart of the working elderly, driven not by a desire for activity, but by the threat of a bench warrant. This system of enforcement creates a profound sense of alienation. Brandon, who once felt like a stakeholder in his community, now feels like a fugitive. He avoids checking his mail, he fears phone calls from unknown numbers, and he becomes increasingly withdrawn from his children, as the financial friction of the support system colors every interaction. This is the invisible price of the perpetual payer status, the erosion of the father-child bond through the lens of a balance sheet. The United States family court system in 2026 is an efficient machine, but it is a machine that often fails to account for the human reality of economic volatility. For the man navigating this part of the demographic study, the goal is not just to pay, it is to survive the administrative weight of the state. But how does a man find a way out? Is there a path to restoration? Or is the demographic trap of divorce a life sentence? In the final part of this masterclass, we will pull together all the threads we have discussed: the financial erosion, the health collapse, the social ghosting, and the legal subordination. We will look at the demographic data on the resilient minority, the small percentage of men who successfully rebuild their lives, their health, and their wealth after a total dissolution. We will explore the specific strategies they use to navigate the year 2026 and beyond, and the final conclusion on what the future holds for the American male in the era of high-stakes divorce. This is the closure of the loop, the blueprint for moving from a statistic to a survivor. To understand the blueprint for moving from a statistic to a survivor, we must analyze the resilient minority. Demographic studies in 2026 identify a specific cohort of men who, despite the financial erosion and social ghosting we have discussed, managed to reconstruct their lives with a level of stability that exceeds their pre-divorce baseline. This is not the result of luck, but of a specific data-driven approach to the aftermath. According to longitudinal research from the University of Michigan and similar institutions, roughly 15 to 20% of divorced men in the United States reach a state of post-traumatic growth within 5 to 7 years. These men are the outliers, and their strategies provide the only empirically validated roadmap for navigating the long-term reality of the 2026 divorce landscape. Imagine a man named Marcus, a 50-year-old engineer in Denver in 2026. Marcus finalized his divorce 3 years ago, losing his family home and 40% of his retirement assets. In the first 12 months, Marcus was the textbook definition of the demographic risk profile: isolated, professionally stagnant, and facing a significant health decline. However, Marcus transitioned into the resilient minority by adopting a 3-pillar strategy of radical pragmatism, institutionalized health management, and financial pivot maneuvers. This is the case study of how a man survives the 2026 system. The first pillar is emotional decoupling and the end of the litigation loop. Historical trends in family court show that the men who suffer the greatest wealth loss are those who continue to use the legal system as a theater for their emotional grievances. In 2026, the cost of a contested hearing can exceed $5,000 per day in legal and expert fees. Marcus realized that every dollar spent fighting for the principle of a specific asset or a minor scheduling detail was a dollar he was taking away from his own future reconstruction. Demographic data indicates that men who move to a low-conflict, business-like communication style, often utilizing the gray rock method where interactions are kept brief, factual, and non-emotional, see their legal expenses drop by an average of 45%. By treating the divorce as a closed business transaction, rather than a continuing moral battle, Marcus preserved the liquid capital he needed to fund his recovery. Step by step, Marcus then addressed the second pillar, the institutionalized health protocol. We have already established that the mortality rate for divorced men in 2026 is an existential threat. Marcus countered this by automating his health advocacy. Since he no longer had a spouse to monitor his vitals, he utilized wearable medical technology integrated with an AI-driven primary care platform. He treated his cardiovascular health like an engineering project. Studies of the resilient minority show that men who join high-intensity, community-based physical programs, such as jiu-jitsu, rowing clubs, or even structured hiking groups, show a 30% faster reduction in baseline cortisol levels compared to men who exercise alone. This community element solved the social ghosting problem simultaneously. Marcus built a new tribe of men who were focused on physical performance rather than couple-centric domesticity. This shift in his demographic social circle was the primary factor in stabilizing his mental health and ending the cycle of isolation. The third pillar is the financial pivot. In 2026, the traditional path of saving 10% of a paycheck in a 401k is often insufficient for a man paying 35% of his net income in support. Marcus had to move from a mindset of accumulation to one of aggressive utility. He utilized the remaining liquid assets from his divorce to invest in high-yield, tax-efficient vehicles that were shielded from future support recalculations in his jurisdiction. Case studies of successful divorced men in 2026 show that they often shift their professional focus toward roles with higher variable compensation or equity stakes that are more difficult to value and garnish than a traditional base salary. Marcus took a role with a smaller firm that offered a significant equity package. This demographic move allowed him to rebuild his net worth in a way that the traditional support formulas often struggle to capture, providing him with a shadow retirement fund that secured his future. Furthermore, we must look at the future of the American male in the era of high-stakes divorce. As we move further into 2026, the demographic data is beginning to show a retrenchment effect. Younger men, observing the statistics we have laid out in this masterclass, are fundamentally changing their approach to the domestic contract. We are seeing a massive surge in the use of prenuptial and even postnuptial agreements among middle-class professionals. These documents are no longer seen as a lack of trust, but as a standard of demographic insurance. In 2026, a man entering a marriage without a clear definition of separate property, business valuation methods, and a waiver or cap on alimony is increasingly viewed by financial planners as taking an uncompensated risk. The demographic trend is moving toward the disaggregated household, where financial lives remain largely separate, even while the emotional life is shared. Another emerging trend is the digital asset shield. In 2026, as wealth is increasingly stored in non-traditional assets, ranging from cryptocurrency and decentralized finance protocols to intellectual property and digital brands, the legal system is in a constant state of catch-up. Men in the resilient minority are often those who have diversified their holdings into these newer categories before a divorce filing occurs. Historical trends suggest that the legal system's ability to discover and value digital assets is roughly 5 years behind the actual technology. While this does not constitute legal advice, the demographic reality is that men who possess digital native wealth often emerge with more of their net worth intact than those whose wealth is tied entirely to traditional residential real estate and W-2 income. But the final conclusion of our masterclass is not about the money. It is about the redefinition of the patriarch. The American man in 2026 is learning that his value and his identity cannot be solely dependent on a single domestic unit that can be dismantled by a 70% initiation rate. The survivors are those who develop a decentralized identity. They are fathers, but they are also community leaders, health advocates, and professional innovators who maintain a life that exists independently of their marital status. This is the ultimate potential outcome. A man who is fortified against the volatility of modern family law. As we close this 10-part deep dive, the data remains clear. The United States family court system is a legacy machine operating in a high-speed, digital world. It is a system that often prioritizes the status quo of the 20th century over the demographic realities of the 21st. For the man watching this today, knowledge is the only armor. You have seen the metrics of asset erosion, the psychological traps of the custody cliff, the biological reality of the health collapse, and the legal machinery of the perpetual payer. You now have the full demographic picture of the American divorce landscape. The loop we opened in part 1 is now closed. You know why the most established men are the most at risk, and you know how the resilient minority navigates the storm. But the landscape of the American family is continuing to shift at an unprecedented pace. There is a new, even more complex demographic movement appearing on the horizon: the rise of the single-father household and the legislative push for default equal parenting across all 50 states. What will the family court of 2030 look like, and how will it handle the first generation of men who entered marriage with total informational transparency? That is a deep dive for another time. For now, take this data, audit your situation, and remember that in the world of demographic studies, you are either the architect of your future or a point on someone else's chart. Control the variables before they control you.